Good evening, folks. If you're just joining us, we're going to get started in just a couple of moments. Thanks for joining us this evening. We're really looking forward to this presentation. We're glad you've joined us. So we're going to get started momentarily. Thanks again.
Hi, I'm Dorothea, and I'm glad you're here too. You're going to love this one.
I'm David Williams, and I'm glad you're here three. The more the merrier.
Yes.
Absolutely. Looks like we've still got quite a few people entering the program. So again, we're just going to get started momentarily.
Welcome, everybody.
Quite a few people trickling in. Thanks again.
Pull up a chair, get ready. Lots of good pictures and a good presenter tonight. Thanks for coming.
Still got some folks joining us. Okay, well, it's 6 p.m., so we should probably get started. And again, thanks again for joining us tonight. My name's Michael King. I'm the Executive Director here at the Southwest Seattle Historical Society, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to welcome you to this evening's program. It's going to take on a slightly different format than we've utilized in previous iterations of this program via Zoom, so we're looking forward to that as well. Before we begin, though, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that the Southwest Seattle Historical Society and our Log House Museum are located on the traditional land of the Duwamish people, past and present, and we are grateful to the Duwamish people for stewarding this land throughout the generations. We are, of course, thrilled to be joined tonight by author David B. Williams. We've been looking forward to this presentation for quite some time. We are also incredibly grateful for the support of our partners at the Seattle Public Library and our sponsors For Culture, Luna Park Cafe, Duwamish Tribal Services, and Home Street Bank. We could not do this without their support. And of course, we can't do this without you, all of our supporters and friends. So thank you for joining us tonight. If you are inspired this evening by what you hear and are interested in purchasing a copy of Homewaters, I would encourage you to visit our partners at Paper Boat Booksellers here in West Seattle, where you can find some copies of this wonderful book. I'm sure they would be grateful to sell it to you. And of course, they've been a great partner of the Historical Society. Again, tonight, we're going to be utilizing a slightly different format. We're going to be utilizing an interview, more of a conversational format. So we're looking forward to that. I know many of you have participated in Zoom programs before, so it probably won't come as a surprise. But if you have a question for David this evening, I'd ask that you please enter your question into the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your screen this evening. And our moderator tonight will direct those questions on your behalf to David after he concludes his conversation. With all that said, I'm going to turn things over to Dorothea Hendrix, who's the chair of the Words, Writers, and Southwest Stories series, and she's also a member of the Historical Society's Board of Trustees. So Dorothea is going to be conducting this evening's interview. And Dorothea, thanks, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, David, for being here. I want the rest of you to know that David B. Williams is a naturalist, author, educator, and freelance writer in Seattle. His many books include Homewaters, that he's presenting tonight, Seattle Walks, Stories in Stone, award-winning Too High and Too Steep, Kerns, Waterways, and Street Smart Naturalist. He has presented several of these books to our Words, Writers, and Southwest Stories series earlier. An online source tells us David's most notable work so far was his Stories in Stone, written in 2009. It was the finalist for the Washington State Book Award and for the Northwest Writers Fund Grant. David's interest in urban geology was sparked by the use of stone in the downtown Seattle downtown Seattle Transit Tunnel. Born in Lexington, Kentucky, David moved to Seattle when he was 5 and began his education here. He later went to Colorado College, where he initially studied physics, quote, majored in field trips, but switched to what some call geology. Now, those are his words. And earned his Bachelor of Arts in geology there. He also worked as a park ranger at Arches National Park in Utah. David returned to Seattle to be a writer of natural history books and occasional urban geology tour guide. He was employed at Seattle's Burke Museum in 2014 and is happily married, living in the Licton Springs neighborhood of Seattle. Now, before we move on to the interview, I want to tell you that when confirming David's presentation to us, he asked that we arrange an interview format instead of the straight up book presentation. We discussed it and agreed I could do that. He forwarded a copy of his brand new book, Homewaters, A Human and Natural History of Puget Sound, to me to read, and I prepared the interview questions with his editing, of course. I think you, the audience, will find this a very special book, and David will introduce it to you now. David, you're on.
Great. Thank you, Dorothea, and thank you, Michael, and thank you to the Southwest Seattle Historical Society for this great series over the years and for encouraging the dissemination of history and respect for all cultures who live in this part of the world. As Dorothea said, what I'd like to do is begin with a short reading from the introduction to the book. So I'm just gonna launch in because that's the kind of guy I am. In the summer of 2018, I grieved with millions of people around the world. Our collective sadness focused on a 20-year-old mother, Tlaaqua, one of a dwindling number of orca who regularly visit Puget Sound. On July 24th, Tlaaqua had given birth to her second child, a daughter who died within 30 minutes. For the next 17 days, she carried the 6-foot-long body of her dead offspring on a journey of more than 1,000 miles. Finally, Tlaaqua let her calf go. Our hearts broke. Then 2 years later, on September 6, 2020, it was with much joy that whale researchers announced Tlaaqua had given birth 2 days earlier. The healthy and precocious boy calf, dubbed J57, was born in the Strait of Juan de Fuca after an 18-month gestation. To paraphrase Emily Dickinson, hope is a baby orca in Puget Sound. Mourning the loss of a child is a natural response for humans and orca. Both species are smart, self-aware, and deeply connected to their families. Clearly, Tlaaqua, like us, had loved her daughter and did not want to part from her. And as we learned, her extended family tried to help by providing food for the grieving mother. Ecologists suggested that they might also have been mourning with her. Tlaaqua and her family are members of a group of more than 70 orca known as the Southern Resident Killer Whales. These animals, which evolved a culture and community unique to their home in Puget Sound, travel together, hunt together, and communicate using their own distinctive dialect. Solidifying their cultural affinity, the Southern residents also rely on the collective knowledge of their elders, particularly the matriarchs, who act as guides and teachers to their family members. Why shouldn't they also love and grieve together? And why shouldn't we also love and grieve with Tlaaqua? Few animals are as sacred and iconic to Puget Sound residents as orca, or in more dire straits. Habitat loss, disturbance from noise and boat traffic, exposure to an ever-increasing toxic mixture of pollutants, and overfishing of their favorite food, salmon, have pushed the Southern resident population to the point where their very survival in Puget Sound is in doubt. For many who followed Tlaaqua, their grief for her was compounded by their grief for the environment of Puget Sound and the way its degradation affects orcas and humans. If Tlaaqua and her calf couldn't thrive, what did it mean for us? More than any other story, Tlaqua's loss crystallized the central environmental challenges of Puget Sound. The orca are suffering, the salmon are suffering, we are responsible. For most of my life, I've lived within a few miles of Puget Sound, the narrow inland sea between the Cascade and Olympic mountains. I knew that I lived by troubled waters, but I did not fully grasp the magnitude of the crisis that had been rising around me, like the tide submerging a low island. Although I saw myself as someone deeply aware of my natural surroundings, I realized I simply hadn't paid close enough attention to the place I love and where I intend to reside for the rest of my life. I needed to take heed of all the people who have lived here, how they've related to the landscape over the millennia, and how their stories could provide a better understanding of the conditions now shaping the lives of modern residents. Furthermore, as a writer who is generally focused on stories about the land, I had not fully appreciated the water and those who dwell in it. Standing on the shoreline or riding a ferry and seeing only the surface of the water, which tends to appear untainted and beautiful, I had long failed to see the interconnected lives of the plants and animals beneath, and to understand how they sustain and breathe life, both metaphorically and literally, into Puget Sound. The effects of human activity, overfishing, pollution, and climate change reach deep beneath the surface. Our actions, their lives, our lives. We cannot cut one strand without unraveling the many connections that link us. This book then is my way to rectify my lack of understanding of the cultural and ecological history of my home waters and to provide a resource for others. The more of us who know and care about this place, the more momentum we can build to change our ways. We have reached a critical confluence for the waters of Puget Sound. Paraphrasing Wallace Stegner, is this a native home of hope where we can create a society to match its scenery, or will we succumb to baser values? Since I began writing Homewaters, my own enhanced appreciation and understanding of Puget Sound's incredible diversity, beauty, and potential for recovery have led me to believe that the most valuable assets of Puget Sound are not the resources we have long extracted, but the relationships that residents can make with this place. Learning from the past is central to forging and nurturing those relationships and to creating a positive future for Puget Sound and all its inhabitants. By taking this journey, I feel I gained an extra insight, extra dimension of sight. Now, when I look out over the surface of the Sound, I can see deep into its history and the peopling of the landscape, its residents' travels by canoe, steamer, and ferry, their endeavors to carve out a living, and their fears of invaders. I can see deep underwater to lush forests of exquisite beauty and complexity, to corpulent clams that can outlive people, and to fish whose annual spawning creates a spasm of desire, attracting uncountable numbers. I can also see into a future where I have hope. If the residents of Puget Sound hold this place to be special and unique, as I think we do, then we will recognize our responsibility, not only to this generation, but to the generations to come, human and more than human. Thank you. So that's my introduction. Dorothea, I turn it over to you for beginning our conversation. I'm quite looking forward to this.
Thank you, David. I just wanted to make a comment that I have learned so much from reading your book, and now as you reread that preface, it touches my heart, and I hope it does the audience too, and our conscience. I think that's important, that you're, anyhow, all that you're saying is important. All right.
Thank you.
Next question. In the chapter that you called Birth of a Place, you've included a great historically graphic description of geologic structures called sills and a fjord here, caused by a great glacier that formed Puget Sound. Could you please tell us more about what is known as the Puget Lobe?
Yeah, and we will come back to this map, but I just sort of I figured nice to have a place to see where we all are. We all know, but always good to have this at the beginning. So 17,000, 18,000 years ago, thereabouts, there was a massive ice sheet that spread from Canada down between the Olympics and the Cascades into this area that we now call the Puget Lowland. And geologists refer to this lobe of what's called the Cordiaran Ice Sheet, which is that big, massive ice sheet up in Canada. This was a little finger that just poked down into Seattle, sort of prodded into this part of the world. And ice extended a little bit past Olympia. And when it passed through here at its greatest depth, it was about 3,000 feet thick, going through Seattle, about 5,000 feet in Bellingham, maybe 1,000 or so in Olympia. But that ice and the movement of the ice was central to forming the landscape that we have in this region. And really two big features. One, is that the sound itself, which was not actually carved by ice, but by water flowing underneath that ice. If you have a 3,000 or 5,000 foot thick sheet of ice, you can have a lot of water flowing under it, and it carves into the landscape and excavates out this very sinuous shape of the Sound and Hood Canal. So water was key, but as that water flowed underneath, it periodically hit harder layers. And those harder layers resisted erosion and left behind little ridges or sills, as geologists call them, at a couple of critical points. There's one up here at Admiralty Inlet, there's one down at the Tacoma Narrows, there's one at the mouth to Hood Canal. And what's important about those, and what I write about in the book, is that it affects the circulation of water from the strait into Puget Sound. And it affects the larvae, it affects nutrients, but it also affects some of the pollutants, so that as water passes over the sills, it has a tendency to get mixed and bubble up. And we've all seen this. We've been out on the Sound and seen these what look like bubbles rising under say, a ferry boat. And they occur throughout, but particularly strongly at these sills. And it's that mixing that's really important to bring the nutrients up, to allow the larvae to feed on them. But also it affects, as I said, the pollutants, which instead of just flowing out of the Sound, get recirculated, what someone described as the memory of Puget Sound. So the sills are a benefit, but they also create some issues for it. And if anyone who's read my writing knows, and as Dorothea mentioned, geology is the way I see the world. So the geologic story is the way I begin, and to me it really helps understand many of the bigger stories of the Sound.
Very good and complete. You also wrote about a long multi-generational story of people in the area and the relationship between them. The land we now inhabit in the chapter Peopling People's Puget Sound. Tell us more about the Indigenous people, the explorers, the British residents, and the white Americans as they moved into the Sound and how they treated the land and each other.
Yeah, one of my goals in this book was to try and take a deeper dive, a deeper look at the story of the Sound. I think we're probably all cognizant of the fact that many of the early histories of Puget Sound were written with the point of view of, in 1792, George Vancouver discovered Puget Sound. Well, we all know that people have been living here for thousands of years, since time immemorial. And I wanted to tell that deeper story, really look at the way people have moved into the landscape. And there's a couple of lines of evidence from archaeological point of view of how long people have been here. Probably the best spot is over in Redmond near the near 520, there's a spot where they've done some archaeological work that dates back to about 12,500 years ago. And those were the first people that we know were in this area that at least left archaeological evidence behind. They came to use some of the rock and make projectile points. And they came into a landscape very different from what we know today. It was a landscape that had only recently been sort of cleared out. Think about that ice moving through here. It would have, it scraped the landscape, removed basically all life that was living here, all the big things that we sort of think of as the modern landscape, all the fish, all the animals, all the trees, all of that's gone. And these people then move into this area shortly after, just a couple thousand years after the ice, or maybe even more recently after the ice had moved out. They find a very open landscape and they adapt to that landscape over time, and they adapt to a landscape that's changing over time. There was interesting periods of geology then, lots of volcanic activity. The land is literally popping back up, what geologists refer to as isostatic rebound, as that ice had pushed down on the land, sort of like if you take a little, say a rubber ducky here, and you push it down in a bathtub, it bounces back up. The land did the same thing. The land acted like a rubber ducky. It sort of poof, bounced back up. And that had a drastic change on the people, because their land is being shaped around them and altering. So they move in, they adapt, they evolve, they develop relationships. They develop relationship with salmon. They develop relationships with herring. They, over time, learn how to move through, understand the seasonality, understand the movement of animals. And they're here for thousands of years and have this superbly adapted life, which continues today. As we all know, all the different tribes here, the indigenous people, still have that knowledge and still act in that way, have this deep understanding of the landscape. But then we start to see a big change. First, in about 1792, Vancouver sails down the Sound, becomes the first European, and the first settlement we see is down about at Fort Nisqually. It's not at, it's at Fort Nisqually in the 1820s when the Hudson's Bay Company moves in. This was that great British concern of looking at ways that they could acquire fur, and they eventually also do quite a bit of farming. But they begin a new relationship to the land. And to me, this is really a central theme through the book, is how do people relate to that landscape around them? And the first people to come really have a relationship with the land and with the people here of, I wouldn't necessarily say exploitation, but they're here to make money. They were here to take the furs out and sell them. And it was a pretty decent relationship between the British and the native people. The downside, of course, is that we start to see smallpox has arrived prior to this. It arrived in Puget Sound probably sometime in the late 1880s, we're not sure. So the population has changed, this decimation of the people through these diseases. Then we get the Americans to arrive. They first start arriving just a few years later. We see them in the 1840s. We see the first settlement, and they bring a very different relationship. They bring a relationship that's antagonistic to the native people, sort of, and if you will, almost antagonistic to the land, because they came to exploit, they came to own the land. It was a fundamental change. It's very different. And so I try and weave those stories together and look at how each group has related and what it says about this changing relationship of place, changing relationship to the land, which is always what I'm trying to do in the book.
Thank you. Did you have a slide about the origin of Puget Sound place names?
I have one, yeah, here, yes.
And I didn't know if you were going to pick up on
Yeah,
that.
I mean, one of the things, yeah, thank you. I mean, one of the things that I did in the book that I thought was was one of my goals is to talk about the different groups that come into this part of the world and put together a map that just talks about, shows some of those changes. And one of the things that really struck me is the fact that I think we often overlook, another group that's overlooked is the Spanish exploration. The Spanish actually arrive in the Strait of Juan de Fuca before the British. They settle, they establish a spot up on Nootka Sound, but they then travel down and into the strait, and they're moving through this area before Vancouver sails down the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And we still see that reflected on the landscape. And I think we often tend to overlook that and forget that. The San Juans, the Orcas Island, Guaymas, all these Spanish names are still on the landscape. Then we have, of course, some of the Vancouver names many things. You know, the classic one, of course, is Puget Sound, naming it after his lieutenant, Peter Puget. And when he does that, he really just refers to the South Sound down here as Puget Sound. But then we also have Wilkes, he's an American explorer. He comes in 1841, names dozens upon dozens of places, and we still have those names. And then a handful of names from the Hudson's Bay Company. So I think looking at the names on the land, to me, is a really important way and a good way to understand those relationships, the native names, the Spanish names, the British names, and what they mean, and how do they reflect that relationship? How do they reflect the connections that each group has with this place? Always changing too.
Yeah, good. When writing about the historical defense of Puget Sound, you wrote that around 1886, the government decided an upgrading of the system defending the United States was needed. So a, quote, triangle of fire was planned to ensure the Puget Sound harbors were places and homes worth protecting. So what local fortifications resulted here?
Yeah, I mean, that was really one of the genesis of the book for me in some ways, was thinking about, these forts that I had noticed at the north end of Sound. I mean, I noticed, we all noticed them: Fort Worden, Fort Flagler, Fort Casey, up at Admiralty Inlet, on either side of Admiralty Inlet. And I was wondering, what was the story of those? What did they mean on the landscape? So as I started looking into that story and started to try and understand better this idea of defending a place that you love, what struck me are two things. One is looking at from post-settlement point of view, is that these forts which get completed right at the turn of the 1900s. That idea of trying to protect Puget Sound starts in the early 1850s. That many surveys come out, look at this area, talk about, evaluate, try and understand, is this area worth protecting? And for many decades, it wasn't. For 50 years, 45 years, it was not deemed worthy of protection, probably because there weren't enough people here. But then we start to see a change, and Puget Sound is deemed worthy, that we are a place that's worth the federal government spending the money to build a series of forts. Those three, Worden, Flagler, and Casey, the triangle of fire, so that any vessel that would try and come down through this triangle could be blasted out of the water. You may be aware that not a single shot is ever fired at any enemy. The forts were obsolete by the time they're done, but they represent, again, an idea that to me is very important. It represents a relationship between people and place, that in building those forts and having that desire to have forts built, the people who move here go from being just settlers to people who describe this place as home. Puget Sound becomes their home waters and a place that they want to protect. And they look to the federal government to offer that assistance. And when that finally comes in the guise of the Triangle of Fire, then Puget Sound, the residents can sort of think of themselves as part of the country, that they are now worthy of being protected. So that was one level, and I thought that was an interesting story. But then I looked at the Sound more, and one of the things that struck me, of course, is that the Indigenous people who lived here had the exact same feeling, that they lived in a place that was home. These were their home waters. They wanted to protect their home waters. They were concerned about people coming down from the north, from other areas, potentially raiding and creating problems. So as you can see from the map on the left, there were a huge number of defensive sites in this area that were built over the thousands of years that people have lived here. These are ones that have records, archaeological records, variety of things down here, whether it was little, what are called trench embankment fortifications, these sort of circular ones. These would be an area that were out on a point, and then there'd be almost like a moat separating that defensive site from anyone coming from land, and it'd usually be up a little bit, or lookouts. But again, to me, the idea is that people were concerned about their home. They were concerned about this place. All of the people who've lived here have had this deep relationship with this landscape and want it to be protected. They want to feel safe. So it's a long running through line of Puget Sound, of the entire history of Puget Sound, is this relationship between people, their fears of invaders, their fears of losing what they love. And it's a story that we, of course, are still telling. We're still thinking about it to this day on somewhat perhaps on different levels at times, of our concern about the place that we live, of protecting the landscape that's out there. So that's where I ended up going with that.
The Maritime Highway, the waters. David, would you recount for us the connected history of the Maritime Highway on the Puget Sound, from canoes to steamships, the Mosquito Fleet to the ferries of the present, acknowledging what you referred to as, quote, how the water continues to shape the values and actions of those who perceive the connective threads between people and place.
Yeah, and one of the things that you've obviously gathered from, I hope, from what I'm saying is these connections. And I wanted to, in writing this book, I really wanted to take an approach not only of looking at the deeper history, but also to tell the stories of both the people and the plants and animals. Because to me, understanding Puget Sound and understanding any place, really, we benefit by looking at what I think of as the natural history. And by that, I mean looking at the nature and the human history together and trying to understand that. And on the Sound, for the first 12,000 years plus years, really till relatively recently, until the 1900s, water was the primary means of travel. That's how people got around. They could certainly hike across and walk across areas, but water was central. And we've had a variety of sort of, I guess, if you will, means of transportation, ways to move across it. And for thousands of years, the primary means were the canoes, of course, these beautiful, beautiful vessels that had been crafted and adapted and evolved to place. And there are different styles reflecting different areas. So something like this larger canoe at the top, this what sometimes referred to as a war canoe. This was a boat that would be found out on the open water, on big water, out on the strait or out on the coast. Whereas within the Sound, you'd have different vessels that were specifically adapted to that relatively calm nature of Puget Sound. You know, if you think about the Sound, relative to other waterways, it's somewhat benign. Yeah, we've got fog that's pretty challenging, and we've got the tides and the currents that create some issues. But we don't have to worry about hurricanes. We don't have to worry about cold weather too much. It doesn't get too hot here. We don't have too many bugs. Getting into the Sound is relatively easy. I'm sure you're all familiar. You try to enter into the Columbia River, into the bar there, arguably one of the most dangerous spots on the globe. We have it pretty good here. And so people have adapted these wonderful ways of moving through. We also see vessels that were specific to being on the upper waterways, up on the rivers. So people had adapted for thousands of years to create this wonderful canoe culture. Which still, of course, exists. Anyone who's seen the canoe journey, if you saw it when it was landed at Alki, that's a whole nother issue that I don't want to get into, but I know there's a bit of a controversy over that. But that was just amazing to see those canoes come in. Then everything changes in 1835 when this boat, the Beaver, arrives in Puget Sound. And the Beaver had been built on the Thames. It was built for the Hudson's Bay Company, built on the Thames in London. It's outfitted initially as a paddle boat, but then converted to a sailing ship, eventually comes into Puget Sound and becomes the first of what, of course, becomes known as the Mosquito Fleet, that great armada of vessels that plied the waterway, and really was, like the canoes, the sinews, if you will, that knit together the Sound, created community, because it allowed people to live anywhere in the Sound. Canoes, the same way. You could go anywhere and you could connect with people. Mosquito Fleet, the same way. You could live someplace and connect with the bigger transportation, the bigger hubs, the bigger population centers. If you needed your goods, it could be brought out. Maybe you needed money, it could be brought out. You needed gossip, it would come with the captain, with the people on the boat. So just an amazing system, almost like a sort of an Uber or Lyft system. It went everywhere, and it was really the central to the story of Puget Sound. And the vessels came in all sizes. The smallest was one that I came across, was the 19-foot vessel called the Polkey, which I just think is a great name. And then as big as almost 300 feet, and the Yosemite, this grand vessel. So boats have been central to the story and are still central to the story on two levels. They're very practical, but I also think there's this deeply spiritual aspect, that you're out on the Sound and you're sort of seeing the big story out there. And that to me was a really fascinating to get to learn that, understand that, and think about the ferry system and what does it mean for this 13,000 year story of the maritime history of Puget Sound.
Good. I have a question coming in, but I'm going to hold it till the end, having to do with the water and new people coming in. I'm going to move to the question about the issue, I should say, of the forests in the Sound. What kind of forests, you call it, are in the Sound, David? Would you tell us what those crops are, what they're used for, and how they're grown?
Yeah, and one of the things that was really fun for me, and one of my goals in working on this book, let me just give you a little bit of additional background. So when I came up with the idea for this book, What Becomes Homewaters, I spent 6 months interviewing scientists, interviewing historians, tribal members, to try and understand what were the important stories to them. What did they think needed to be conveyed? What hadn't been conveyed as much about Puget Sound? And so that leads me down the avenue of several of the stories I've already talked about. But then it also led me down, as you can imagine, with natural history. We are all familiar with the two big species, salmon, which obviously are more than one species, but the group of salmon, and orca in the Sound. But there were all these overlooked species that I was basically convinced of, and for legitimate reasons, were really essential to understanding the Sound. And one of them is the kelp population here. We have 18 or so species of kelp in Puget Sound. This one, I love this one. You see it at low tide. This is an understory species. And Dorothea was asking about the idea of the forests of Puget Sound. And of course, we're familiar with the temperate rainforest, the terrestrial forest, these grand ecosystems with multi-levels, with just an amazing area for all the animals and plants that live there. But underwater, we also have forests of kelp, where we have species such as these, the laminaria, that are an understory species. But then there are the overstory, the big tall species, the bull kelp, the ones that come up all the way up to the surface. We've all seen them. They look sort of like a turkey baster with a flamboyant hairstyle, the blades growing out of those. And it's this ecosystem is central to the Sound because it's a nursery for dozens of species of animals, little things, and invertebrates, fish that are taking advantage of it. It's a safe haven when animals are older, that they're able to go into this. It's an area where they find an incredible amount of nutrients. So very important for all of the life here. And like so many other things, so many other species, and particularly the ones I was trying to focus on, they have this deep story, this deep connection to people, that kelp has long played an important role for the native people, the indigenous people of this area, using it for a variety of different purposes. We see some non-native use of it. There's some fun stories that I'm not going to tell you about that you'll have to read the book to find out about. But again, this is this overlooked, critically important ecosystem that has changed over time in the Sound. And there's just some really interesting stories about those these deep relationships to the species and the species adaptation to the specifics of the Sound that make it, to me, again, just this exemplifies what I was trying to do with the book. How has a species adapted to place, and how have we as people adapted to that species over the thousands of years that people have lived here? And they're just totally cool looking.
I loved a lot of those stories, specifically. So speaking of species, okay, now how about all the fish in the Sound? What is what you call critical gatekeeper of energy flow you referred to in the Sound, and why do you call them that?
Well, I call them that because someone told me I should say that. So one of the biologists I talked to told me this, and he's referring to herring. And it was interesting, today I was talking to someone who lives on Staten Island, and he said, yeah, when I think of herring, I think of pickled herring. And yeah, that's, I think, how many people know of it. But again, another one of these species with this deep relationship. Looking at the archaeological record, herring are as important to the indigenous people of this part of the world as salmon. You see their record in the archaeological record stretching through thousands of years, dozens and dozens of sites around this part of the world always have herring in them. And herring are important on, again, this cultural level, but from an ecological level, they are this gatekeeper. They're the hub of Puget Sound because they eat little things, convert them to food for bigger things. So if we have a healthy herring population, we are going to have a healthier salmon population. We're going to have a healthier orca population. And that's one of the, I think, just one of these fish that's overlooked. We don't think of it. And I just sort of say in West Seattle, one thing that's wonderful that's happened in the last few years in West Seattle, probably many of you have seen this, is when the herring spawn. One of the highlights for me in the book, in my research, was to go out one day and see the herring spawn, on Alki Point a few years ago, and to see this amazing array of life. We're past this season's big spawn down here, but if you ever have the chance to see it, it is well worth it to go and see this incredible dynamic of life, from the birds to the fish to the invertebrates that are all involved in this riot, in this feeding frenzy of this animal that is so, so critical to Puget Sound.
Interesting connection between, I mean, I'm learning, of course, from you, how they depend on each other, the different species. You mentioned in your book the many different groups that allowed you to accompany them to research all these aspects of the sound. And I'm curious, how did you learn of and arrange all the different trips, tours, and excursions in your research for this book? And you were good about a lot of stories.
Yeah, and that was really a highlight for me, to be able to go out in the field. As I said, I spent 6 months interviewing people and trying to find out what's important to them. And then as I narrowed down what I was doing, I basically just sort of got back to it. I did what all writers do. I asked questions. I went into this with questions. I went into this working on this with really no assumptions about anything. All I knew is I wanted to try and get the stories that helped, I thought, understand the past, helped us see how the past led to the present, and how understanding the present and the past helps us to think about a way to create a better future. So I spent a bunch of time out with biologists, just saying, hey, I'm working on a book, would you take me out in the field? So I went out with all sorts of biologists. I went out in looking to try and catch herring in Admiralty Inlet on a little 14-foot Zodiac. I was with some biologists looking for fish, and that was sort of a funny story that didn't make it in the book, but we were looking for fish. I think we were off Whidbey Island, if I remember correctly, and there were a couple divers with us, or I was with a couple divers, and they go down and we're looking, it's fairly shallow water, and they sort of stand up because their areas are shallow and less shallow. And all of a sudden we realize that the boat we're on is stranded. It's the tide's dropping, and we get stuck there for the next 3 hours or so waiting for the tide to change. And I couldn't complain. What an amazing thing to be stuck in Puget Sound and watching the tide rise around me. And what really struck me about all of the biologists who I dealt with was their deep passion and concern for this place. All of them were trying to better understand the sound, what the stories were, how did species interact, how did our actions affect those species, and how could we create a better sound. And that was something that I feel incredibly privileged, was to be able to go out with people to see the different species. And throughout the book, I wind in many of my biological expeditions to help, I hope, people see the sound in a better light, to get what I sort of described at the very beginning, that new dimensions of sight, to be able to see under that surface, to see the incredible life of Puget Sound, because those of us who live here are incredibly blessed to live in this fabulously beautiful place, and to be able to go out in the field. For me, as I said, it was a privilege to spend so much time out with different people, to see the animals, to get to an inkling. And I was just getting an inkling of what was out there in the sound. To think about Puget Sound being more than 900 feet deep at its deepest spot, average depth of about 200 feet. Chesapeake Bay and San Francisco Bay, these real famous bays, they're something like 20, 30 feet average depth. They're just not that interesting compared to Puget Sound. We've got it good here. And I was lucky enough to see it. And I think we are lucky enough to live at a time when people are recognizing the importance of this place and are looking at it through the lens of sustainability, of stewardship, of protection for all species. And that is really a central part of the book for me, is this idea that we are all interconnected. And that's why looking at something like Kelp, which tells a story and illustrates these interrelationships, herring, the interrelationships, the relationships between the waterway and how people travel, all of it, it forms that story of Puget Sound.
You included a lot of fun stories in there, and you were blessed to have those opportunities. We would be blessed to have some of those opportunities to see firsthand what you saw.
Yeah.
My next question has to do with referring to the heading of old fish and new laws in your book. Could you explain why you say salmon are one thing and herring or something else, and tell us what fish you refer to as magnificent and why?
Yeah, this is a copper rockfish. The rockfish are just this amazing group of species. They're the most diverse group of species in Puget Sound, at least from in a single genera. There's 27 or 28 species within the sound. And they are just completely fascinating fish, beautiful fish. They are deep dwellers. Many of them live down hundreds of feet. I was lucky enough, again, to go out with some biologists. You can't catch rockfish. It's illegal to catch them. We were out doing a study, so I got to see them, just this incredible, incredible fish. And one of the aspects of the fish that makes them incredible, magnificent, their scientific name, Sebastes, means magnificent, is their great age. I think for many people, and I would certainly count myself this way prior to working on the book, I think of a salmon, and a salmon with that handful of years of life. They go out, they come back, maybe 2 years, 4 years, 8 years, not too many years. They're fairly young. Fish just don't seem to live that long. Herring, they're just getting eaten all the time. But rockfish can live for over 100 years. Rockfish can live for over 200 years. They're the oldest fish living in this area. There's a species called the rough-eye rockfish that we found. They found ones in Alaska that live 205 years. And the way you determine that is with this bone right here. This is called an otolith, or an ear bone. We all got ears. And they have these bones, and like a tree, they produce a yearly ring. And by studying those, the biologists were able to determine that how long they live. And that has had significant repercussions for our management and for our mismanagement of the species, because it wasn't until just in the last couple decades that we realized how long these fish lived. And so it's this huge change by people better understanding the biology of this fish. We are now working to be better stewards, but without that knowledge, we made many mistakes in terms of how we manage it. And so it was this idea of these beautiful fish, these incredible, incredible fish that can live for so long and deep down, and how we can be better stewards is really what it came down to, by understanding the biology better. To me, it was just a fabulous story.
It is. And you didn't mention the Alaskan Sea Anemones. And then I want you to move into talking about the Gooey Ducks at 173 years of age.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite pictures in the book. I mean, if any of you have a caption you want to share with me, I love this picture. When I found this, you can imagine how excited I was to see this. It's just such a crazy picture. Gooey ducks, of course, we all know this monstrous beast that is out there, these clams. The story of them goes back, again, of course, thousands of years of the relationship. The word gooey duck comes from Lashutsi, the indigenous language of the Sound, meaning dig deep, because they're those clams that are buried in the sand, and you really have to be tenacious and voracious to dig one up, as these fine gentlemen clearly are exemplifying. But over time, we've also learned that they don't just live in the intertidal zone. They also live subtidally down to 300 feet or so. And there are millions, hundreds of millions of these clams out there, and have become, as I'm sure many of you are well aware, an important food source, an important resource that are being harvested in a variety of different ways. And they, to me, exemplify one of the stories of Puget Sound, this idea that the early settlers came into this area with a desire to, or way to react to the land, as I said earlier, of resource exploitation, of using the plants, harvesting the trees, harvesting the salmon, harvesting the herring. And we now are in a relationship with place, as I said, based on stewardship and sustainability. And the gooey duck exemplify that. It's a heavily managed resource, a really interesting way it's managed. There are these gooey duck auctions that I got to sit in on one of those. I got to go out in the field with the biologists who were studying the gooey duck to better understand whether an area could be reharvested. I got to go out with Suquamish divers who were diving down. I got to go to a gooey duck farm. All of these, again, to tell this story of how do people relate to place. And this animal, it's such a crazy, crazy story. And I'm going to leave this because I think we want to open it up to Q&A. I'll just leave you. This is the adult. If you ever have a chance to see a baby gooey duck, they are super cute, about the size of a pinto bean, and they have a little neck that sticks up and it wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. So I'll just leave you with that thought, with a little baby gooey duck, cutest animal, one of the cutest animals in Puget Sound. How about that, Dorothea?
All right. Well, I have another question about that, but I'll wait and ask it later too. I'm not asking for a recipe, but I'm not from this area. I don't know how you dig them, how you cook them, how you eat them, but you can explain that later or now. I don't care.
Oh, let's open it up to Q&A. That would be fun too. Should we do that?
Right now? Sure.
Yeah.
All right.
We'll leave this picture up because it's a fun picture, and then we'll.
Well, then you want to go on and tell me how you dig them and cook them and eat them?
No, you're gonna have to figure that out yourself, Dorothea. I'm that kind of guy.
All right. Okay. And we'll wait for the final question later. But okay, here are the questions. David, you talked about your own transition from paying a lot of attention to the land to look at the water too. What did you notice about the more recent people of this place, post 1850, who related best to the water, who best to the land? Judy Bentley here is thinking of the differences between perhaps those coming from the Midwest and those coming from the Hawaiian Islands or the British, Scandinavians, and so forth.
That's a really interesting question. I think how people relate to landscape, and I did not drill down as much as that. I mean, I think people who've come here, I can use Seattle as an example. The people who come to Seattle, the early settlers, and particularly things like the Denny Party, come from the Midwest, and their relationship to this place is really based on land. And harvesting the trees. That was what they did, harvesting or quarrying the coal and exporting it. It was very much a land base, even though there were certainly fish were moving out here pretty soon. But we also see down South Sound, we see some different developments. And I can't really answer that in terms of how the different groups were coming in. Did they bring in a different, if you will, maybe not aesthetic, but a different understanding of place? We certainly see the different groups coming in and recognizing the different resources over time. And what to me was really interesting is that the earliest things that were being exported were the oysters, the Olympia oysters. And so it was a very easy animal to harvest, and an animal that was on that boundary between the water world and the land world, because they were on the tidal lands and they would get exposed. We've all seen oysters be exposed. They're different species now, but it's that bridge between land and water was our first relationship, at least of European settlers to this place, and how that's played out over time throughout as people went deep and then went on the land. I can't really say specifically from the different groups that moved in, but it's an interesting question to think about.
Good. We have a couple of questions about the herring picture. Can you pull that back up again? For the lack of the best words, what are they using?
They're just drying the herring on these racks. They've harvested them and then dried them, and then they're selling them. Herring was used for a lot of that. The herring would be shipped out over time. It was a food source that people would use it as bait for other fish. So herring's it's this interesting story that it gets brought up on land and then gets thrown back into the sea. But so lots of dried herring going on. It's an easier way to ship it too. So
I think I saw a term around that picture that was hauling a drag seine of herring.
A drag seine, yeah. So there's a different picture that has a drag seine. That's just showing how they're harvesting the herring. It's this net that would be set out in the water, sort of a big arc, and then they would pull it onto land to do it. It's not the best thing to do because it's pretty devastating because it brings up so many other species. So.
I remember some stories you included there. Typically, that was Andrea's question. Someone else asked, typically, when does the herring spawn, the date range to ask for, and how do you learn when it's predicted for a particular year or season?
Yeah, the herring spawn in the Sound runs from about January to April is the main spawning season. The area up at Cherry Point, up by Bellingham, is a much later spawn, can go all the way up into June. But the state has basically tracks when all the herring spawn generally are, and they usually are pretty accurate. So if you go to the Washington State Fish and Wildlife site, you can find more information about that. And particularly the spot that I found to see them has been really good of late is over in Hood Canal. And usually that's in about April. We start to see the herring spawn over there. And it's a pretty fun event to see just all the wildlife.
Ooh, excellent. That was his next question, or her, about what's a good location to view. Let's go back to the Gooey Ducks. Deb wants to know how you manage something that lives 300 feet into the sand.
Well, they live 300 feet deep in the water. So what they do is the area that's established for the herring, for harvesting of wild herring, it's either between 17 and 80 feet or 18 and 70, roughly that range, about 18 to 80 feet of water. So the management, interestingly enough, is really like an old growth forest. They auction off the rights to harvest a particular area. The state divers have gone down, looked at it, evaluated it, determined if this is a good area, meaning dense enough for the gooey duck to be harvested. They then auction off the rights, people pay, they go, they harvest, and then that area is closed until they decide that it is a safe place to harvest again. And I was out with people who were looking at spots that had been 30, 40 years since they had been harvested and were not yet at a safe spot, because these animals do have this very slow lifestyle. So it's one of these things where it's very different than, say, a salmon harvest where you go out and you can collect salmon over a wide area. with Gooey Duck, you have a very specific little grounds that you can harvest them. So it's a fascinating story.
I had no idea. Interesting. Back to the picture about the forts and settlements. Why the key Fort Nisqually settlement location? Was there something about being as far south?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You know, I think probably, I don't know, maybe like many people, I shouldn't speak for others. I had a very narrow view of the world living in Seattle. And I know that Seattle gets settled 1851, the first, the Denny party arrives here, and they come in by boat. They've come up from Portland. They come in by boat. They land at that little bench at Alki. And so I thought that's how people arrived, but that's not how the early settlers arrived into the Sound. The early settlers came from the south. They came up from Fort Vancouver. The British travel from Fort Vancouver up the waterways and end up at Fort Nisqually. So it was at the South Sound because it was closer to where they had begun from down at Fort Vancouver. And they found this big, open, wonderful spot to get established. So that's why the South Sound gets established earlier. When the first settlers, American settlers, come in particular, George Washington Bush, who is African-American, had come across from somewhere to the east in the Midwest, I don't remember exactly where, gets to Oregon. The racist laws, the very anti-African-American, anti-Black laws in Oregon force him across the border, across the Columbia River. He and others in his party settled down at what we now know of as Tumwater. They called it Newmarket, but those were the first settlers, first Americans, because of American citizenry in the United States, because they were coming from the South. And that's why the Sound has that Southern development first, and then things come from the North and they sort of meet in the middle.
Well, makes sense. Thank you. Deb has a couple of other questions about herring. That particular picture, you don't have to go back to it, but is that Port Townsend?
I don't know where that specific herring shot is taken. It doesn't say on the photo record that I have of it.
And someone was asking about that equipment in the water. Look toward the water. And what is the community in the background of the Mosquito ship built in the Thames? I would say that.
Oh, in the Thames. Oh, this one right here actually happens to be up in Vancouver. It's one of the few good photos we have, of the Beaver. The Beaver, being a British possession, went up and down the Sound, ends up in Vancouver, Victoria, where this photo is taken. But we just don't have a good photo of it from right within Puget Sound proper. So I cheated a little bit. I apologize.
Okay. Personal question for you, I guess. If you could travel back to any point in the Pacific Northwest history, when would you visit?
Oh, that is the easiest. Clearly, if I go back to one point, I'd actually leave Puget Sound. I would go south. I'd watch the Missoula Floods, the Great Ice Age floods. If I could see one event in geologic history on Earth, doesn't make a difference where, I would go to watch the Missoula Floods. If you're not familiar with those are these giant floods during the last ice age that carried volumes of water that we can't even imagine. That would be the coolest event to see if I had to go back from a geologic point of view. If I had to go back from sort of a human history point of view, I think just going back to see what this place looked like in, say, 1750, to see the incredible diversity, to see the forest, to see the native people here before the smallpox arrives and just decimates the population, to see these people and places that had adapted over the thousands of years. I think that would be pretty astounding.
I like that too. And I want to add something. Years ago, my husband and I picked up a video from the park ranger at, what's it called, Dry Lake Falls. A video had been made about the Missoula flood, and it was dynamite, just like you said.
Yeah.
I wish I still had it, but I don't. Maybe somebody can find it. Back to the Duwamish people, a question to ask about, as they continue their pursuit of recognition as an indigenous tribe, does your research support their quest?
You know, I did not necessarily look into that, and I do not at all pretend to speak for any Native group. I was very privileged to spend some time with a variety of Native people here, and I just hope that what I've been saying and say in the book is respectful of what the cultures that I learned. We do know from what, again, that the Duwamish were involved with the signing of the treaties. So yeah, I would say yes. I mean, they are their record goes back. They are certainly part of the story of the Sound for thousands of years, and recognition seems to be something that should something that should happen for them.
Yeah, I agree. I'll drink to that. William wants to ask, any consideration in your book of water sports, from competition like boys in the boat, sailing regattas, to sport fishing, to pleasure craft?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I thought about that. And I think that that is a whole nother storyline that I did not ultimately pursue it, because I had this singular focus of, once I sort of got involved thinking about the Mosquito Fleet, the ferry, the canoe system, it fit together as a storyline that I thought, again, explained a connection. Not to say that going down the storyline that you're talking about wouldn't have been just as interesting. It's just I chose to go a different route on mine.
Yeah, I agree. I want to get to our final question, but Patrick is asking, U.S. Grant was supposedly stationed on Puget Sound in the 1850s and proposed digging a canal from the South Sound to Grays Harbor. Did he actually submit such a plan?
I'm trying to remember. I mean, I know Grant was out in this part of the world, and there were various proposals like that. I do not, off the top of my head, remember. I remember doing that research, but I just do not remember the specifics of it. I'd have to look it up. If you emailed me at my email address at through my website, geologywriter.com, I'd be happy to look it up again. I know I have information like that. It just is, there's only so much space in my little brain, but sadly.
That's fine. Thank you. They're thanking you already, but before we lose more people, I want to get this, because I have a special place in my heart for this last chapter of yours. You started it in a statement that homebodies have a sense of belonging, feel whole connections with their area, have established relationships and a way of living there, like salmon, like us. Some of your concluding statements challenge us to accept the, quote, historical degradation of Puget Sound, which include climate change and the influence of the ecosystem. Tell us what we need to be watching and actions we could be supporting to preserve, enhance, and restore the evolutionary process that created what we have in the Puget Sound.
Yeah, I mean, it really sort of gets to sort of, if you will, a fundamental of what I was trying to do in the book is offer one, as I think I've said before, these ideas of connections, offer a sense of hope, because I think we do have the potential to improve this place. And not necessarily a series of prescriptive actions, but things that I think of that ways to consider our relationship, that all of us are involved in this. We are all part of this story here. We are all interconnected. So our actions are very important. Driving a car and you put your brakes on, that copper washes into the streams, which washes into the Sound. So we're each contributing. So when I think of things that people can do to be part of this system in a positive way, I think on several levels. We can think from a regulatory point of view, and on a basic level, elect officials who believe in climate change and care about climate change, whether it's local, state, or federal levels. Get to know the landscape around you, develop that relationship with the landscape that's around you. Get involved with groups that are working to protect this place. Groups like Puget Sound Restoration Fund, the Sound Action, the Northwest Straits Commission. All of these groups are working to be involved with the sound. Get to know the sound. I mean, to me, I still think one of the best ways to just be part of the sound, to be present in the sound, is watch the tide. Go on a low tide day and sit at Mi'kmaq and just watch the tide go out and watch the tide come back. Sit there for hours and develop that relationship, develop that connection to place. And I think in doing that, and I know for myself in doing it, it's just fostered this desire to want this place to continue to be protected, to continue to have stronger sustainability, better stewardship. And it operates on many levels, from regulatory to helping scientists understand it, to beach pickups, to contributing financially to environmental organizations. So there's many, many levels that we can participate in. And that's part of it, is participate and be present on the land.
Good response. What an excellent, comprehensive, and sensitive presentation, David. Thank you so much. People are thanking you a lot, and I want to verbalize that to you. Katrina says, this has been a fabulous event. Thank you for organizing and offering this to museum members.
Yeah, and I guess I would say one final thing for, I know Michael, we're lucky enough to have him give the final word. Just reiterate in terms of, one, to thank the Southwest Seattle Historical Society for pulling together this long-running series of allowing people who are like myself, who are passionate about this place, to share their stories. So I want to thank you again. And if you are interested in the book, yeah, support your local bookstore. I mean, you all are blessed to have this great new bookstore, not exactly new, but last couple of years of Paper Boat. So please support them. And again, I thank you all for being with me. So I turn it over back to you, Michael.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Dorothea. That was fantastic. That was magnificent. I hope everybody enjoyed this evening's program as much as I did. Just a magnificent program. So thank you again, David, for joining us tonight and sharing some insight into your book and research and the process and what we can do to help maintain this wonderful place in which we live. Thanks again to all of our sponsors and our partners at the Seattle Public Library, again, For Culture, Luna Park Cafe, Duwamish Tribal Services, and Home Street Bank. We can't do this without their support. As David noted, again, I strongly encourage you to support Paper Boat Booksellers, where this book is available. So if you don't have a copy yet and you're inspired to purchase one, I encourage you, again, to stop by Paper Boat Booksellers. As a friendly reminder, although the Log House Museum is currently closed to the public, we're going to be reopening to the public next weekend. So please take a look at our website, loghousemuseum.org, so you can learn more about the experience of coming back to the museum. We're really eager to welcome you back. You can also learn more about some of our upcoming programs. And if you'd like to support the Historical Society through a donation or supporting us by purchasing a membership, you can do that on our website. Again, loghousemuseum.org. Thank you again for joining us tonight. We're looking forward to seeing you next month. In the meantime, again, stay healthy and stay safe and do what you can to maintain, again, Puget Sound and the place we call home. So thanks again. Take care.
Thank you, Michael. Buy David's book. You can buy it at other bookstores, of course, but I want to support David in all of his efforts, his research, and your wonderful knowledge. You're doing a wonderful thing for our Earth, David, especially in the Puget Sound area.
Thank you. I deeply appreciate that.
Yes. Bye, everybody. Thanks for being here.
Take care, everyone.